The best hockey jersey pattern I've ever used was hanging in someone else's closet 6 months ago. I bought it secondhand, took photos of every piece, made a pattern from it, and used it to make this, a Star Wars hockey jersey for May the 4th. I went this route for 2 reasons. 1, every sewing pattern I could find for a hockey jersey looked like it was AI generated. And 2, I'm just too tall for any clothing brand on the market. So if I want stuff like this in my closet, I have to build it myself. The results? Better than I expected, but getting there, that's a completely different story. The first step was getting the jersey onto my cutting mat as flat as I could and photographing every piece. The cutting mat grid is important here. It gives me a known reference so I can correct for camera distortion later. For pieces that were too small or too awkward to photograph cleanly, like this one on the back of the lace section, I covered them in masking tape, traced them, and then photographed the tape. I could have just taken the jersey apart, it would have been faster, but I wanted to keep it intact. I knew I wanted to look at it as a reference for construction when I was actually building mine. To clean up the photos, I used a tool I'm building called Seam Beam. It helps you unskew and adjust pattern photos to be the right size. If you want to hear about it when it's ready, there's a sign up link in the description. If you're trying to do this yourself right now, you can get the same results in Photoshop or GIMP. You just warp the image until the cutting mat grid is square and then scale from there. It works, it's just fiddly. With the photos calibrated, I brought them into Inkscape and traced out the pattern pieces. I'd already tried the jersey on by this point, so I knew what to change. The sleeves needed to be longer and the body narrower. I wasn't going to actually play hockey in this thing, so I wanted it to feel like a jersey, but fit better than a real one would. Pattern done, time to cut a mock-up. I cut it out using my projector. I have a full video on how to use a projector for sewing patterns. The link is in the description. The construction order was front to one sleeve, back to same sleeve, then up the side. Since the sleeve pattern was symmetrical and this was a mock-up, I only sewed one sleeve. The other arm got an open armhole, enough to check the fit without doing the work twice. The shoulder section on the donor jersey was actually 2 pieces sewn together, so I pinned and sewed those, then marked the center to make it easier to place. And then immediately realized I'd patterned the shoulder piece wrong. So I traced the correct shape directly off the assembled mock-up, added seam allowance, cut new ones, and sewed them together. I marked the seam allowance, pinned them on, and stopped, because the shoulder on this jersey was rounded, and rounded shoulders are a pain to sew. They're also a pain to resize if the fit's off. So before I sewed a single stitch, I went back and looked at a bunch of hockey jersey references, and a lot of them just have the body meet the shoulder at a right angle. That would be easier to build, way easier to adjust, and honestly look better to me. So I seam ripped what I'd done, added a fill piece to part of the sleeve where the rounded section used to live, sewed it up, and squared off the shoulder. With the new shape, I pinned and sewed it to the front and back, reattached the sleeve, and sewed from sleeve hem to bottom hem. At this point, I'd made enough big changes to the pattern that I didn't trust mock-up number 1 anymore, so time for mock-up number 2. I updated the Inkscape file, cut new pieces, and started sewing. And almost immediately found another mistake. The neck hole on the front piece didn't match the neck hole on the shoulder. I'd forgotten to account for seam allowance when I split the pieces. So I sewed a strip of fabric on to fill the gap, and then recut it with the right seam allowance. I sewed the shoulder piece to the front, then the back piece didn't match the shoulder width either, so I trimmed it down and sewed it on. Then I sewed the sleeve on and the sides up. This is part of the process that people don't really think about. Mock-ups aren't just for fit, they're for catching every dumb little pattern mistake before you cut into the good fabric. I made 2 mock-ups on this build, and I'm glad I did. Finally, it was ready to try on. The sleeves were too wide and the body was too wide, so I marked those to be taken in. I knew I'd be wearing this with a sweatshirt underneath, so I put one on and tried it on again. Luckily, the fit checked out. With the fit dialed in, time to design the actual jersey. So I looked at a lot of references, real hockey jerseys plus the nerdy versions other companies have done. I landed on an X-Wing Pilot Rebel-inspired direction, orange, black, and white. I came up with 8 design options and sent them to my friends. We all coalesced around this one. I marked the design directly onto mockup number 2 using a quilting ruler for the stripes and a bowl as a stand-in for the Rebel logo. First try, the stripes felt too low. Bumped them up, traced everything in Sharpie so I could actually see it. Tried it on again, and it looked right. Now, the lacing piece. Hockey jerseys have the laced V at the front of the collar. The technique to build that requires the lacing area to start completely filled in with fabric. So the first thing I did was sew a piece in to fill the gap. Then I took the back piece and marked it up. Seam allowance around the edges, vertical center line, and 2 slanted lines forming a triangle where the lacing window would eventually open up. Then I pinned a piece onto the front of the jersey and sewed around the triangle. You might be looking at this thinking, Brent, that's the back of the lacing piece. Why are you sewing it to the front? Trust me, this is one of those techniques you have to just trust the process on. Because once you cut down that center line of the triangle, making sure not to rip through the threads and flip the backing piece through the inside, you've got a clean, finished edges on both sides of the V. Fold the seam allowance in, top stitch it down, try it on, and you can see where this is going. Time to finalize the pattern. Before I took the mock-up apart, I traced every seam with a Sharpie, both sides, and noted any adjustments I needed to make. Most importantly, I marked out where every stripe was going to be. Those stripes weren't going to be sewn on appliques. They were each going to be their own pattern piece in the final garment. Then I seam ripped, pressed, photographed, unskewed, updated the pattern in Inkscape, cut the body and sleeve patterns into stripes, and added seam allowance everywhere it needed to go. And finally, to the actual fabric. The fabric is a jersey spandex sport mesh. It stretches in both directions, but more in one than the other. All the tools and materials I used in this build are linked down in the description. With stretch fabric, grain direction matters more than usual. The body and the sleeves needed the larger stretch going across the width, but the shoulders needed the opposite. Cutting took about an hour and a half. There were a lot of pieces. I started with the front body, marked the seam allowances, pinned a stripe on, and zigzag stitched it down. Stretch fabric needs a stretch stitch. A regular straight stitch will restrict your movement and pop when stretched. I had to be really careful keeping the stripes at a consistent width for it to look right, which meant my seam allowances were not consistent. It varied from piece to piece. Then, for the back, I did the same process. Note to self, never sew this many stripes again. They were a pain. They took at least 4 times longer than I expected, and they were the entire reason this project finished way later than it should have. With the front and back done, I attached the shoulder piece onto the front and moved on to the lacing. It was the same process as the mock-up. The backing piece was sewn to the front. I cut down the center of the triangle, flipped it through, and tacked it down. Then to the collar. I didn't bother with a pattern piece. It was just a 4-inch wide strip longer than the inside circumference of the neck hole. I folded it in half and stretch stitched the long edge. I marked the seam allowance with a heat erasable pen on the orange pieces and a chalk pen on the black ones. And here's where I tried something I'd been sleeping on for years, thread tacking. Instead of pinning the collar in place and fighting it, I temporarily tacked it down with white thread. It was white so I could find every stitch when it was time to remove them. Honestly, this was the hero in the whole collar. Pins were never going to work for something this fiddly. I sewed the collar on properly. Removed the tacking threads and searched the inside. Then I looked at it and decided I wasn't happy with the height. So I seam ripped the sewn seam, keeping just the serge seam. That bought me an extra 1/4 inch in collar height. If I were doing this again, I'd make the collar a solid 1/2 inch taller, and I'd look way more carefully at how real hockey jerseys finish the ends of their collars. Last thing for the collar. The ends needed to tuck into the lacing pieces I built earlier. I tacked them in and sewed them down. Here's what the inside of the collar looks like. Time for buttonholes. I needed 6 of them for the lacing. My sewing machine has a 1-step buttonhole feature. It doesn't consistently work for me, so I do all my buttonholes on my embroidery machine. I used a pattern from Etsy that has a bunch of different buttonhole sizes. The link is in the description. I tested it on a scrap of fabric first, then I floated the jersey on hooped wash-away stabilizer. Floating just means hoop the stabilizer, then pin your fabric on top of it instead of trying to hoop the fabric directly. It's useful when the part of the garment you need to embroider can't easily fit in the hoop. You want wash-away, not tear-away for this. Wash-away dissolves in water. When the buttonholes are done, you just dunk it. Tear-away leaves residue inside the buttonhole that's almost impossible to fully clean out. I learned this the hard way. I used the embroidery machine's positioning to space them out and then ran all 6. To open them up, stick a pin across one end of the buttonhole, then seam rip from the other end straight up to the pin. The pin stops you from blowing through the other end. Clean cuts every time. Then for the backing piece behind the laces, I traced the size I needed onto stabilizer. Cut it from black fabric, serged the raw edges, tacked it in place, and sewed it on. The hardest part of the build was done. I sewed the back piece on next. Then the nameplate. That's this little rectangle of fabric across the upper back of every hockey jersey. I held it in place with wash-away Wonder Tape, which is double-sided tape that dissolves in water and won't gum up your needle. Then I zigzag stitched it on. The last thing on the body was serging and top stitching every stripe seam. The seams inside are all serged. The top stitching holds the serged edges flat against the body. I pinned them all running the same direction and used a twin needle on my machine. Twin needle top stitching often has a problem called tunneling. That's this little raised ridge between the 2 stitches. You can see it here. I haven't found a way around it short of using a cover stitch machine instead. I changed my thread color every time I crossed onto a different colored stripe so the top stitching would blend, and I'm happy with how it looks. But if I made another, I'd just use a cover stitch machine. I figured most people don't have one, so it was worth showing the twin needle version. Both sleeves have the same triangular stripe situation. Orange piece, black piece, white piece, all meeting at angles. And it helps to mark the seam allowance, but the trick with these is don't try to sew across the corner in one pass. Sew one side to the corner, cut to that point, then pin and sew the other side. I did that for the seams between each color and both sleeves. I serged the seams, top stitched everything, switching colors to match the fabric as I went. I pinned each sleeve to the body from the center top out, sewed them on with a lightning stitch, which is the closest you can get to a straight stitch that still has stretch. I serged the sides, sewed from sleeve hem to bottom hem with the lightning stitch, then marked the seam allowances, pinned, and twin needled the sleeve hems and the bottom hem to finish. With that, the sewing was done. For the graphics, I put the Rebel logo on the front. For the back, I decided on Skywalker for the nameplate. For the numbers, I went with 77, which is the year A New Hope came out. I cut everything out of heat transfer vinyl on my Cricut. The front logo, the back nameplate, the back numbers, and the sleeve numbers. If you don't have a vinyl cutter, you can get clean cut yourself with a steady hand and an X-Acto knife if you take it slow. The Cricut Easy Press did all the application. If you don't have a press, you can definitely use a closing iron instead. I did that for years. There was one last detail. Most hockey jerseys have a manufacturer tag on the bottom front right corner. I'm the manufacturer on this one, so I cut a piece of black polyester from my scrap stash to match the size on my reference jersey, put my logo on it, and sewed it on. And here it is. The part of the build I'm most proud of is the patterning. Reverse engineering a thrifted garment worked out way better than I thought. I'll take that over fighting an AI-generated pattern any day. If you want to build your own, all the tools and materials I use will be linked down in the description. If Seam Beam sounds useful to you, the sign-up link for that is down there too. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, it helps the channel a lot. If you want to see more builds like this, consider subscribing. And with that, stay crafty, friends.